"Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," the officer said, his voice carrying across the quiet street with the kind of certainty that left no room for questions. The neighborhood fell strangely still. Even the distant sound of a lawn mower seemed to fade beneath the weight of those words. Naomi Brooks slowly turned from the trunk of her SUV, one hand resting lightly on the handle of a worn leather suitcase she had just lifted from the cargo area. The spring sun washed over Maple Ridge Drive in Charlotte, North Carolina, casting long golden reflections across neatly trimmed lawns and polished mailboxes. It should have been an ordinary Saturday morning. Children rode bicycles 2 houses away. A golden retriever barked behind a white picket fence. Wind stirred the fresh dogwood blossoms that lined the sidewalks. Yet something invisible shifted in the air the moment Officer Ethan Collins stepped onto Naomi's driveway. He had arrived only moments earlier after receiving a dispatch concerning a suspicious individual reported by an anonymous caller. From his patrol car, he had seen a black woman unloading luggage in front of an upscale home, and before asking a single question, his assumptions quietly filled in every answer. Naomi looked at him without fear, only surprise. She wore faded blue jeans, comfortable white sneakers, and a simple gray sweater that suggested a long flight home rather than anything remarkable. Her hair was neatly tied back, and fatigue rested beneath her calm brown eyes. She had spent the previous week away on state business, though nothing about her appearance hinted at boardrooms, policy meetings, or government offices. She looked like someone eager to unpack, make coffee, and finally enjoy a peaceful weekend. Officer Collins approached with measured steps, his polished boots clicking sharply against the concrete driveway. His posture remained rigid, his expression unreadable, every movement shaped by habit and confidence. "I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," he instructed. Naomi slowly lifted her empty hands. "Officer," she replied evenly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Before she could finish, a brief, startling moment unfolded so quickly that several neighbors instinctively froze where they stood. The encounter became visibly tense, and gasps spread across the quiet street as people realized something had gone terribly wrong. A young mother watering flowers lowered her hose without noticing water spilling across the sidewalk. An elderly man paused halfway through collecting his newspaper. Curtains shifted behind nearby windows. Phones quietly appeared in trembling hands. Nobody shouted. Nobody moved. The silence itself seemed louder than any argument. Naomi steadied herself, her breathing controlled despite the humiliation that now hung over the driveway like heavy summer air before a storm. She did not raise her voice. She did not answer anger with anger. Instead, she looked directly at the officer and spoke with remarkable composure. "Would you please verify the address before we go any further?" Her words were gentle, almost impossibly so, but Officer Collins barely acknowledged them. His attention remained fixed on the version of events he had already decided was true. Around them, camera lenses quietly captured every second. The sunlight reflected off polished windshields, turning tiny flashes into silent witnesses. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime rang softly, strangely peaceful against the growing tension. No one standing on Maple Ridge Drive realized they were watching the first moments of an incident that would soon reach far beyond their quiet neighborhood. They believed they were witnessing another misunderstanding between a police officer and a homeowner. They had no idea they were actually watching the beginning of a story that would force an entire department to confront the cost of assumptions made before a single question was ever asked. Naomi Brooks had spent most of her life learning that first impressions often arrived long before introductions. It was a lesson her father quietly repeated while repairing old radios in the family garage on warm Carolina evenings. "Character speaks eventually," he would tell her. "The problem is that judgment usually speaks first." Those words stayed with her through every chapter of her life, from college classrooms to government conference rooms, through victories that rarely made headlines and sacrifices almost nobody ever noticed. The modest brick house on Maple Ridge Drive was not the symbol of sudden wealth that some neighbors imagined. It represented 20 years of patient work, careful decisions, and a promise Naomi had once made to her late mother that no matter how successful life became, she would always return to the community that raised her. She knew every family on the block by name. Mrs. Harper across the street always received fresh groceries when her arthritis flared. Mr. Delgado never had to ask for help carrying heavy boxes into his garage after heart surgery. During every Thanksgiving, children from the neighborhood appeared at Naomi's front porch because they knew there would always be homemade sweet potato pie cooling beside the kitchen window. She never announced those small acts. She simply believed kindness worked best when nobody expected applause. Even her closest neighbors understood very little about her profession because Naomi preferred conversations about school sports, community gardens, and weekend cookouts over discussions of titles or accomplishments. They knew she traveled often. They knew she spent long hours reading thick binders on her back patio after sunset. They occasionally noticed black government vehicles stopping by the house before sunrise, but nobody asked questions, and Naomi never volunteered explanations. Privacy, to her, was another form of respect. Earlier that morning, she had driven home from Charlotte Douglas International Airport after landing on the first flight from Washington, District of Columbia. Her suitcase still carried airline tags from a week of meetings that had stretched late into every evening. Inside were neatly organized folders, handwritten notes, and a navy blazer she had folded carefully before leaving the hotel. She had been looking forward to nothing more complicated than watering the flowers her neighbor had kindly watched during her absence, answering a few unanswered emails, and attending Sunday service the following morning. Instead, she now stood quietly beneath the spring sunshine, while unfamiliar eyes attempted to define her before learning her name. Across the street, whispers slowly drifted between neighbors who had known Naomi for years but suddenly found themselves watching her through the uncertainty of an unfolding misunderstanding. Some looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. A few quietly remembered the countless times Naomi had helped organize food drives after hurricanes or volunteered during neighborhood cleanups without ever asking for recognition. None of those memories seemed to fit the picture developing in front of them. Naomi noticed the phones recording from porches and sidewalks, but she refused to let embarrassment shape her response. Her breathing remained steady. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. She knew that moments like these often revealed more about everyone watching than about the person standing at the center of attention. The breeze lifted a loose strand of hair across her face as she glanced briefly toward the blue ceramic flower pot beside her front steps, where bright yellow daisies continued swaying peacefully as though untouched by the tension surrounding them. For one quiet second, she almost smiled. The flowers had no idea that within the next hour, this ordinary driveway would become the center of a conversation reaching far beyond Maple Ridge Drive, touching people who had never heard Naomi Brooks's name but would soon remember it for reasons none of them could possibly imagine. Officer Ethan Collins had worn the badge for nearly 11 years, long enough to believe experience had taught him how to read people within seconds. His supervisors often described him as decisive, dependable, and willing to take control before situations became dangerous. Those qualities had earned praise more than once, but they had also quietly become something else. Confidence had slowly hardened into certainty, and certainty had left very little room for curiosity. Somewhere along the way, asking questions began to feel slower than making assumptions. On that Saturday morning, dispatch had received a call from an unidentified resident reporting a suspicious woman unloading luggage at a home that, according to the caller, did not look like it belonged to her. The statement should have raised more questions than answers, yet the report reached Officer Collins with enough urgency to prompt an immediate response. As he drove through Maple Ridge Drive, sunlight reflected across the windshield of his patrol cruiser while fragments of the dispatch replayed in his mind. Female. Black. Possible trespassing. Expensive residence. Unknown vehicle. None of those details proved wrongdoing, but together they quietly shaped an expectation before he even turned onto the street. Years of responding to emergencies had trained his instincts to search for patterns. Unfortunately, instincts without patience sometimes mistook familiarity for truth. Collins parked at the curb and studied the brick house through the windshield for several seconds before stepping outside. He noticed the dark blue sport utility vehicle backed into the driveway. He noticed the suitcase resting beside it. He noticed Naomi standing alone. What he did not notice was the framed neighborhood appreciation plaque hanging beside the front door, the personalized welcome mat worn from years of use, or the small brass nameplate that clearly read Brooks' family residence. His attention remained fixed on confirming the version of events already taking shape inside his mind. As he walked toward the driveway, he believed he was preventing a possible crime. He never considered that he might be interrupting the homeowner returning from a week of public service. Across the street, several neighbors exchanged uncertain glances. Mrs. Harper quietly shook her head because she knew Naomi had texted her from Washington only the night before, mentioning that her flight would arrive early Saturday morning. Mr. Delgado recognized the familiar vehicle immediately. He had borrowed it just 2 months earlier when his own truck needed repairs. Yet neither of them stepped forward immediately. They assumed the misunderstanding would last only a few moments. After all, a simple conversation should have resolved everything. They still believed facts would arrive before pride took control. Collins, meanwhile, remained unaware that every decision he made was now being quietly recorded from multiple angles by neighbors holding their phones at chest level. He was also unaware that the anonymous caller had already closed the curtains and disappeared back inside the very house from which the report had been made. The voice that started the entire encounter had vanished, leaving everyone else to deal with the consequences. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the neighborhood, while the American flag hanging from a nearby porch fluttered lazily beneath the bright Carolina sky. Everything about the morning suggested peace except the growing silence surrounding one driveway. Sometimes history does not change because of a single dramatic decision. Sometimes it changes because one ordinary assumption goes unquestioned for just a little too long, and by the time the truth finally arrives, everyone present wishes they had paused long enough to ask one simple question first. Naomi slowly lowered her hands, keeping her voice calm despite dozens of eyes fixed on her from every direction. "Officer," she said gently, "would you please look at the house number before we continue?" Her words floated through the quiet morning like a simple request that should have ended everything. The black metal numbers beside the garage door clearly matched the address displayed on the patrol computer inside Officer Collins's cruiser only a few yards away. All he needed to do was turn his head. Instead, he remained focused on Naomi. His jaw tightened slightly. "Ma'am, I am asking the questions," he replied in a measured but unmistakably firm tone. "Do not make this more difficult than it has to be." Naomi glanced briefly toward the brick column supporting her front porch, where the polished brass mailbox reflected the morning sunlight. Everything that proved she belonged there surrounded them, yet somehow none of it seemed visible. She took one slow breath before answering again. "This is my home. I have lived here for years. My identification is inside if you would like me to retrieve it, but I would appreciate it if we could first confirm the address." Officer Collins shook his head almost immediately. "Stay? Exactly where you are." The command echoed farther than he intended, causing another curtain to move across the street. Mrs. Harper stepped onto her porch, concern replacing confusion. "Officer," she called carefully, "she lives there." Collins barely looked in her direction. "Ma'am, please remain on your property." The older woman fell silent, surprised by how quickly her attempt to help had been dismissed. Across the street, Mr. Delgado quietly lowered the newspaper still folded beneath his arm. He had watched Naomi shovel snow from elderly driveways every winter without being asked. He had seen her organize school supply drives every August. Nothing about this morning made sense. Still, uncertainty held everyone in place. No one wanted to interfere with police procedure, yet no one could ignore what they were witnessing. The small crowd continued growing as people stepped onto porches under the excuse of checking mail or watering flowers. Their phones remained pointed toward the driveway, recording quietly without commentary. Naomi noticed each new face but refused to let the growing audience change her composure. "Officer Collins," she said after reading the name stitched across his uniform, "I am trying to cooperate with you." Hearing his own name spoken unexpectedly caused him to pause for the briefest moment. "How do you know my name?" he asked. Naomi nodded toward the badge resting above his chest. "It is right there." A faint ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through two neighbors before disappearing just as quickly. Collins did not smile. Instead, he folded his arms, convinced that maintaining authority meant never allowing uncertainty to show. "You still have not explained why you are here." Naomi looked around slowly, almost as though she wanted the entire neighborhood to hear the obvious answer before speaking. "I came home," she said quietly. "I parked my car in my driveway." I carried my suitcase out of my vehicle. That is all I have done. The simplicity of her words settled over Maple Ridge Drive with unexpected weight. There was no anger in her voice. No sarcasm. Only facts. A gentle breeze rustled the American flag hanging from the porch. Next door, while the distant laughter of children drifted from the neighborhood park less than half a mile away. Life continued everywhere except on this driveway, where time itself seemed to hesitate. Then, from somewhere beyond the curve of the street, the low hum of another engine gradually entered the silence. It was deeper than the sound of an ordinary family sedan, smoother than a delivery truck, and as it slowly approached, several neighbors instinctively turned toward the road, sensing that whatever arrived next was about to change everything. The dark sport utility vehicle rolled slowly around the corner before stopping a short distance behind Officer Collins's patrol cruiser. It was clean but unmarked, its windows lightly tinted, offering no clues about the people inside. The engine remained running for several seconds without anyone stepping out. That quiet pause somehow drew more attention than flashing lights ever could. Conversation stopped. The children who had been riding bicycles at the end of the block coasted to a stop without realizing it. Even the golden retriever behind the white fence settled onto the grass, as though the neighborhood itself had begun holding its breath. Officer Collins glanced briefly toward the vehicle before returning his attention to Naomi. In his mind, it was probably another resident slowing down to watch the commotion. He dismissed it almost instantly. Naomi noticed the arrival as well, but her expression did not change. She simply stood beside her suitcase with both hands resting comfortably in front of her, her posture steady despite the growing number of strangers observing every movement. She had spent enough years in public service to understand that difficult moments often became even more important when people were watching. Character was easiest to describe during calm days. It was hardest to protect when circumstances became unfair. Mrs. Harper quietly crossed her own front yard until she reached the edge of the sidewalk. She did not want to interfere, but remaining completely silent no longer felt right. "Officer," she said carefully, "I have lived across from Naomi for almost 15 years. She belongs here." Mr. Delgado nodded in agreement from his driveway. Another neighbor added softly, "She has the neighborhood association keys. She organizes our holiday events every year." One by one, familiar voices began replacing anonymous assumptions with lived experience. None of them argued. None of them shouted. They simply offered the truth they knew. Officer Collins listened without truly hearing. Training had taught him to avoid outside influence during an investigation, and at that moment he believed ignoring the neighbors demonstrated professionalism. Instead, it slowly widened the distance between what he believed and what everyone else could plainly see. The phones recording from nearby porches remained perfectly still. Several people quietly exchanged uncertain looks, realizing this encounter had already moved beyond an ordinary misunderstanding. Naomi looked toward her neighbors with gratitude in her eyes before speaking again. "Thank you," she said gently. "Please do not argue. Everything will become clear soon." Her voice carried an unexpected confidence that puzzled those standing nearby. She sounded less like someone hoping to prove herself, and more like someone who already knew the truth would eventually arrive on its own. That quiet certainty contrasted sharply with the growing tension surrounding the driveway. The unmarked vehicle finally became silent as its engine shut off. For another long moment, nobody emerged. Sunlight reflected across the windshield, hiding the occupants from view. Officer Collins shifted his weight slightly, beginning to feel the unusual attention gathering around him. He instinctively adjusted the radio on his shoulder, unaware that dispatch had already received several additional calls from neighbors reporting the same incident from very different perspectives. Somewhere inside the communications center, separate pieces of information were beginning to connect. Out on Maple Ridge Drive, however, nobody knew that. They only knew the silence had become almost unbearable. Then the driver's side door of the dark vehicle opened slowly. A polished black dress shoe touched the pavement first, followed by another. The figure who stepped out wore a tailored navy suit instead of a police uniform, carrying a slim leather portfolio rather than emergency equipment. Before anyone could recognize the visitor's face, the individual looked directly toward Naomi with an expression of immediate recognition, and the entire atmosphere on the quiet street shifted in a way that no one present would ever forget. The man closed the door of the dark sport utility vehicle with quiet precision and walked toward the driveway at an unhurried pace, his polished shoes making almost no sound against the pavement. He appeared to be in his late 50s, his silver hair neatly combed, his navy suit perfectly tailored despite the warm Carolina morning. The leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm looked well used rather than decorative, the kind carried by someone accustomed to long meetings instead of public attention. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. His calm presence alone seemed to soften the tension that had settled across Maple Ridge Drive. Several neighbors instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without anyone asking them to move. Officer Collins watched the stranger approach with growing uncertainty, trying to identify whether he belonged to another law enforcement agency or perhaps the city government. There were no visible insignias, no flashing lights, no official markings on the vehicle. Everything about the visitor suggested quiet authority instead of visible power. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing, her suitcase still resting beside her. The breeze gently lifted the edge of her sweater while sunlight filtered through the branches of the flowering trees overhead, scattering shifting patterns of light across the driveway. She looked tired from travel, yet remarkably composed. Her breathing stayed slow and even, untouched by the whispers surrounding her. The stranger stopped only a few feet away before offering a respectful nod. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I hope I am not too late." Naomi answered with the faintest smile. "You are right on time." Their exchange lasted only a few seconds, but something about it immediately caught everyone's attention. There was no surprise in either voice, no confusion. It sounded less like an unexpected meeting and more like two professionals whose schedules had simply crossed paths. Officer Collins glanced between them, sensing that an important piece of the situation remained hidden just beyond his understanding. "Sir," he said politely, "this is an active police investigation." The man acknowledged him with a courteous nod, but did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked briefly at Naomi, silently asking whether she wished to speak first. She slowly shook her head. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, yet the man understood it immediately. He waited. The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful. Wind stirred the American flag hanging across the street. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime answered with a soft metallic melody that drifted through the warm air. Children resumed riding their bicycles at the far end of the block, unaware that the adults remained completely absorbed by what was unfolding. Mrs. Harper folded her hands together, her concern slowly giving way to cautious hope. Mr. Delgado lowered his phone for the first time in several minutes, sensing that whatever happened next would not require raised voices. Naomi looked around the neighborhood she had called home for so many years. She recognized familiar faces filled with concern, kindness, and quiet support. She realized that none of them had abandoned her when the morning became uncomfortable. That thought settled gently in her heart, stronger than frustration and far more lasting than embarrassment. The stranger finally opened the leather portfolio, not dramatically, but with the practiced care of someone preparing to begin an ordinary conversation. Inside rested several neatly organized folders bearing official state seals that caught the sunlight for only an instant before disappearing back into shadow. Officer Collins noticed them immediately. His confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly as questions began replacing assumptions for the first time that morning. Nobody spoke. Nobody hurried. The driveway, which only minutes earlier had been filled with tension, now seemed suspended in perfect stillness, as though even the morning itself understood that the truth was finally about to introduce itself. The man looked at Naomi with quiet respect before turning toward Officer Collins. His expression remained calm, free from anger or accusation, yet there was an unmistakable confidence in the way he carried himself. He extended one hand toward Naomi first. "Good morning, Commissioner Brooks," he said clearly enough for everyone on the driveway to hear. "I apologize for meeting you under these circumstances." The words settled over Maple Ridge Drive with extraordinary force. For several seconds, nobody reacted because nobody seemed able to process what they had just heard. Commissioner Brooks. The title echoed silently through the gathered neighbors. Mrs. Harper blinked in disbelief. Mr. Delgado slowly lowered his phone completely. Even the children at the end of the block stopped riding their bicycles again, sensing that every adult had suddenly become perfectly still. Naomi accepted the handshake with the same quiet grace she had shown all morning. "Good morning, Director Reynolds," she replied. "Thank you for coming." Director Thomas Reynolds turned slightly toward Officer Collins before opening the portfolio in his hands. Resting inside was an official appointment folder embossed with the seal of the state of North Carolina. Attached to it was a schedule for a statewide leadership meeting that had concluded only hours earlier in Washington, District of Columbia. Reynolds spoke evenly, without raising his voice. "Officer, Commissioner Naomi Brooks was formally appointed this week as chair of the State Commission for Police Accountability and Public Trust. She will oversee independent reviews involving departmental conduct, community transparency, and procedural integrity throughout this state." The words seemed to drain every remaining assumption from the morning. Officer Collins stared at Naomi, then at the official documents, then back again. His breathing slowed as realization began replacing certainty. The woman he had viewed through the narrow lens of suspicion had quietly spent years building a career dedicated not to punishing law enforcement, but to strengthening public confidence through fairness and accountability. She had returned home from serving the very communities officers were sworn to protect. Around the neighborhood, whispers disappeared altogether. There was no celebration, no applause, only silence born from understanding. Naomi could have spoken immediately. She could have listed her accomplishments, explained her position, or reminded everyone that she had tried from the beginning to clarify the misunderstanding. Instead, she remained exactly as she had been throughout the entire encounter. Calm, respectful, patient. Director Reynolds looked toward the nearby homes, where phones still recorded every moment. "The Commission believes that trust begins with facts," he said. "Facts require careful review, complete documentation, and equal treatment for every person." His words carried no threat. They sounded more like a reminder of principles everyone already claimed to believe. Officer Collins slowly glanced toward the brass nameplate beside Naomi's front door. Brooks family residence. It had been there the entire time. The address displayed clearly above the garage matched the dispatch record exactly. The neighbors who had spoken in Naomi's defense had told the truth from the beginning. Every piece of evidence had existed within plain sight, yet assumptions had spoken louder than observation. Collins lowered his eyes for the first time that morning. The confidence that had once guided every decision gave way to something much heavier. Not fear of discipline, not embarrassment before the watching neighborhood. It was the unmistakable weight of recognizing that a single unchecked assumption had transformed an ordinary homecoming into a public failure of judgment. As a gentle breeze carried fresh spring air across the quiet driveway, the sunlight reflected softly from the polished state seal resting inside Director Reynolds's open portfolio, illuminating it just long enough to remind everyone standing there that true authority did not announce itself through force. It revealed itself through integrity, patience, and the courage to let the truth arrive before passing judgment. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The neighborhood that had been filled with uncertainty only moments earlier now stood in complete silence, allowing the truth to settle without interruption. Director Reynolds quietly closed the portfolio and stepped back, making it clear that this moment belonged to Naomi, not to him. Every eye turned toward her. She could have reminded everyone that she had asked for nothing more than a simple verification of the address. She could have listed every assumption that had been made before anyone bothered to learn her name. Instead, she looked first at her neighbors. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for speaking when you knew the truth." Mrs. Harper lowered her eyes, touched by the sincerity in Naomi's voice. Mr. Delgado offered a small nod. The gratitude felt genuine because Naomi understood that communities were not measured by whether mistakes happened. They were measured by whether ordinary people found the courage to stand beside one another when those mistakes unfolded. Officer Collins remained standing near his patrol vehicle, his shoulders no longer carrying the certainty that had brought him onto the driveway. He took a slow breath before speaking. "Commissioner Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." His voice was steady but noticeably different from before. There was no authority in it now, only honesty. "I should have listened before reaching conclusions. I should have verified the information before making assumptions. I failed to do that today." Naomi met his eyes without anger. She had heard apologies before during her years of public service. Some were offered because people feared consequences. Others came from a place of genuine reflection. She listened carefully before answering. "Officer Collins," she replied. "Every profession carries responsibility. Mine does. Yours does. What matters most is what happens after we recognize a mistake." The words were spoken gently, yet they carried enough weight that even the neighbors remained perfectly still. Director Reynolds watched without interrupting. This conversation no longer required official documents. It required character. Naomi continued, "The purpose of accountability is never humiliation. Accountability exists so that trust can be rebuilt through truth, fairness, and better choices." Collins nodded slowly. He understood that she could have demanded immediate action or allowed the public attention surrounding the driveway to define the rest of the morning. Instead, she chose something far more difficult. She chose fairness over emotion. One of the younger neighbors quietly lowered her phone. Another followed. Within seconds, nearly everyone stopped recording. Somehow the story no longer felt like a spectacle. It had become something more personal, something that reminded each person watching how easily assumptions could replace understanding if left unchecked. Director Reynolds finally spoke again. "The proper review process will move forward exactly as it should," he said. "Every fact will be documented. Every statement will be considered. Every person involved will be treated with dignity." Naomi agreed with a simple nod. "That is how public trust survives," she said. "Not because mistakes never happen, but because no one stands above the responsibility to learn from them." A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers across the quiet street as sunlight reflected from the windows of the surrounding homes. The tension that had filled the driveway throughout the morning slowly gave way to something quieter and far more lasting. It was not victory. It was not defeat. It was the difficult beginning of understanding, built one honest sentence at a time, exactly where judgment had arrived long before the truth. 3 months later, the maple trees along Maple Ridge Drive had turned a deeper shade of green, and the neighborhood had quietly returned to its familiar rhythm. Children chased basketballs across driveways after school. Families gathered on front porches as the evening air cooled. Fresh flowers bloomed beneath the same mailbox where strangers had once paused to question whether Naomi belonged. Time had not erased what happened that Saturday morning, but it had softened the sharp edges, leaving behind lessons that lingered longer than headlines ever could. The official review had followed. Every established procedure. Statements were collected. Body camera recordings were examined. Neighbor testimony was documented alongside dispatch records and communication logs. Every detail received the same careful attention Naomi had insisted upon from the very beginning. There had been no shortcuts, no special treatment, and no public spectacle. The process reflected the very principles she had spent her career defending. Officer Ethan Collins completed additional professional training focused on procedural fairness, communication, and decision-making under pressure. He accepted every requirement without argument because somewhere during those difficult months he had realized that accountability was not the end of a career. It was an opportunity to become the kind of officer he had believed he already was. On a quiet Thursday evening, Naomi returned home after another meeting in Raleigh. As she stepped from her vehicle carrying a stack of folders beneath one arm, she noticed a familiar patrol cruiser slowing near the curb. The window rolled down, and Officer Collins offered a respectful nod. "Good evening, Commissioner Brooks." Naomi smiled warmly. "Good evening, Officer Collins." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need to revisit the past because both understood it had already changed them. Collins finally broke the silence. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not for making the process easy, because it was not. Thank you for making it fair." Naomi looked toward the row of homes stretching down Maple Ridge Drive, where porch lights had begun glowing one by one beneath the fading summer sky. "Fairness is what allows trust to return," she answered. "Without fairness, no one truly wins." Collins nodded once before continuing his evening patrol. This time, he drove slowly through the neighborhood, not searching for assumptions, but paying attention to people. Mrs. Harper waved from her porch. Mr. Delgado smiled while trimming his hedges. Children laughed as bicycles rolled past beneath the streetlights. Ordinary moments suddenly seemed extraordinary because they were built upon something stronger than certainty. They were built upon understanding. Naomi carried her folders inside her home and paused for a moment before closing the front door. The brass nameplate beside the entrance caught the last golden rays of sunlight exactly as it had on the morning everything changed. It had never moved. The address had never changed. The truth had been there from the beginning, waiting patiently for someone willing to see it. A gentle breeze stirred the wind chime hanging beside the porch, filling the evening with a quiet melody that drifted across the peaceful neighborhood. Naomi stood for one final moment, listening to the familiar sound before stepping inside. The driveway became still once again, not because anyone had forgotten what happened there, but because justice had finally spoken in the calm voice of truth, leaving behind something stronger than resentment and far more lasting than fear. In the quiet that followed, Maple Ridge Drive looked exactly as it always had, yet everyone who called it home understood that kindness had proven itself stronger than assumption. Dignity had outlasted judgment, and the most powerful form of authority would always be the courage to choose fairness when the easier path was simply to be right. This is the end of our story. Thank you so much for visiting our channel and spending your time with us. We truly appreciate every view, every comment, and every moment you share with our stories. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like to support our channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming videos. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to keep creating more high-quality stories for you. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next video.